TopMedTalk. Monty Mython here. As we prepare to move into the next phase of the COVID crisis, we're going to be widening our focus here on TopMedTalk. We will continue to deliver COVID-specific programs, but we all have a huge additional responsibility as we try to reboot normal services. So although this piece is not directly related to COVID-19, we believe it's information that is crucial to the bigger task of rebuilding the healthcare system as we learn to adapt and live with this new virus. Thank you to our sponsors and to you, our listeners, for helping us to share this important information.
Hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. We are coming to you post a very successful EBPOM London meeting. And here to join us from London is our editor-in-chief of TopMedTalk, Professor Monty Mython. Hello, Monty. How are you?
Jezra, I'm great. I've managed to have some sleep.
Well, I'm glad you caught up on that. I'm jet lagging, I think, because I totally changed my schedule to be here in London or to be in Louisville on London time. So it was a little rough.
I think we were all so tired that we felt young again.
Oh, is that how we're describing it?
Jet lag without the planes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, well done, everyone, for pulling off EBPOM 2020 live from London. I'm sure many people who listen know, because I know many of them came along. We were hoping to get a few hundred people along to the meeting, which is what it would normally, if it's physically in London, we'd have a few hundred, maybe up to 1,000 in the room and a few hundred, maybe 1,000 listening. But when we had over 8,000 were actually logged in listening, we were very, very pleased with the global reach. And again, it really was a global engagement. Yeah. And when they totted up the screen time, in other words, the time that people actually, we can only assume had eyes on, in other words, the video streams were running, it was over 2 years of continuous screen time. So, hurrah. Well done.
Hurrah. Yeah. Well, congratulations. It was put together very quickly. Once COVID hit, we realized we were going to have to pivot. But EBPOM has been doing some virtual broadcasting and meetings in the past before, so we were kind of already positioning ourselves for that.
Yeah. I think that people have been a little bit wary of the virtual experience. I think it's very much comes down to the quality. Yeah. So I think a lot of people had put a very low quality camera in the corner of the room, and you've had the talking head and the death by PowerPoint. And I think that we transitioned over the years into being much more of a conversational experience with pre-recorded lectures on our e-learning platform. And the fact that we were having, maybe 6 people from around the world having a dynamic, lively conversation informed by online questions that just kept coming and coming, and you could vote them up and down was great. I think people had, I think the reason they stayed, because it was a great show, a great conversation. Yeah. And then they went back and watched the pre-recorded lectures. Homework is difficult, isn't it?
It is, but once you see that person present on a panel, you're like, I really need to listen to that lecture. Yeah, that was good. Well, Monty, we did our first ever, it was TopMedTalk, EBPOM production for the first ever POCAPALOOZA.
We did, and that worked. That seemed to work too.
Do you think people understand what a POCAPALOOZA now is, Monty?
Well, the people who are listening do. In the words, because we have a global audience, we decided to go for this crazy idea where we'd start in Cape Town in South Africa at 8 o'clock British summertime, and every 4 hours we'd jump around the globe. And with a month to go and a little bit of COVID-19 rest periods, it seemed like a great idea. Like 4 o'clock in the morning on day 3.
Maybe not so much.
It seemed like a bit less of a good idea, but it worked. And the T-shirt, I think, is very cool.
The T-shirt's cool. And we were raising money for, well, first of all, POCAPALOOZA, Perioperative Care Festival. Yeah. That's what that means.
Palooza. Yeah.
Palooza Fest. And so we still have a lot of work to do to spread the word about that. But one of the things I think that came out of it that was absolutely fantastic, and something on TopMedTalk we've been talking about for about a little over a year now, is raising money for the African Perioperative Research Group. And I believe last time I checked, we were almost to 8,000 pounds. And I know that there were some Australian guys who donated that it wasn't coming through yet. They said it wasn't going to come through till the end of the week. So we should be seeing, hopefully we'll see that soon too. So put us over that 8,000 mark, which originally we were only hoping to get 2,000 pounds. So.
Well, we're going to if 8,000 people come to the meeting, we should be able to average at least £1 each out of them. Come on.
I think
so. We're going to keep guilting them for a while on that one.
We are.
Yeah, so because we started in Cape Town and finished in Cape Town, and the Pan-African group is doing great work.
They are. They're doing amazing work. So you can find more on TopMedTalk about that. You can watch it on our YouTube channel, some of our conversations that we had during the POCAPALOOZA. What we also did during the meeting, in addition to the main stage, TopMedTalk had our own zone. What we would normally do when we're at a conference, we would be either be in the exhibit hall or somewhere around chatting with KOLs, those who come to the meeting, friends of ours, and just have our roundtable discussions that we normally would. And we were able to do that during our meeting, and lots of amazing conversations that we had about shared decision making, about some of the initiatives that are coming post-COVID, some of our partners, as well as talking to Bruce Bickard and Salome Maswimi, again, about her feature in the Lancet that just came out. So I urge you to check that out. But again, like I said, we did chat with some of our partners during the meeting, which Medtronic was a sponsor of ours. And we had the opportunity today, Monty, to actually catch up with some friends from Medtronic to chat a little bit more about what's happening there. And we have Vafa Jamali, who's the Senior Vice President and President of the Respiratory, Gastrointestinal, and Informatics for Medtronic, here with us. Vafa, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, Medtronic, obviously we heard a lot about all the work that you guys have been doing during COVID to come up with things, solutions such as the Ventilator Training App, as well as some of the remote monitoring that you guys were developing or working on at the Javits Center, and then rolling that out beyond that. So thank you so much for all that support.
It was a distinct pleasure to be able to be part of a solution in such a difficult time for all communities, in fact.
Yeah. Well, Vafa, tell us a little bit more about your role there at Medtronic and your leadership position.
Sure. I've been with Medtronic for about 11 years, and in my current role, I run a number of businesses, including a gastrointestinal business, which is focused on chronic diseases and cancers of the GI tract. And then we've got a couple of respiratory businesses. One is really focused around the therapies, the respiratory therapies, and that includes our ventilation, our video laryngoscopy. And then we have another business called patient monitoring, which is a very large business, which is intended to, just what it says, is monitor the patient while they're in care at a hospital. And then we tie these together with another group called Informatics, which is an emerging business, which, can you deploy new technologies? Can you marry a little bit of the new tech with older medical devices to make them easier, make them remote, make them more comprehensive, make it less of a passive number that you look at versus maybe a little more directive. So those are some of the ambitions that group has. So that's really what I do. I run the business. We have many thousands of people working here, and it's a really rewarding place to be.
Well, also joining us is Jennifer Doyle. She's the Global Vice President for Medical Affairs for that same group, Respiratory, Gastrointestinal, and Informatics. Jennifer, thank you so much for sitting down and joining us on TopMedTalk.
Yeah, thanks, Desiree. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your role there? When you say medical affairs, it's a kind of a big umbrella.
Yeah, so I've also been at the company for a long time. It will be 18 years in September, so quite a bit of time. Most of my career has actually been here. So medical affairs in our business group, there's a little variation across Medtronic of the definition of medical affairs, but for us, it's really like an umbrella function that includes several teams that really work together to help, drive products to market, but then also break down the barriers to adoption. So my team includes clinical research, so generating all the evidence for regulatory approval and also for post-market studies to drive adoption of the product and provide evidence that people need to make decisions to use our products. We also include reimbursement, which is, as you all know, a very critical component of being able to actually use a device. Evidence alone and being a cool device is no longer enough. Reimbursement is really critical. Physician or HCP education. So how do we train physicians, nurses, administrators, and others on our devices, and really our disease state areas are really critical to make sure that they're used safely, effectively, and in the right manner. And then we also have a team of clinicians. So physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, that are out talking about the products, peer-to-peer education, and actually really helping to guide internally the business on, decisions of what we develop and what markets we go to.
In COVID-19, there was an interesting clash of demands and the ability to match those demands. I don't mean here from the point of view of the supply of equipment, which we've dealt with on other podcasts. I meant suddenly that we'd managed to acquire additional equipment, and now we wanted that one-to-one training, that prof ed, etc. And someone said, but hang on a second, they're not allowed in the hospital. How did you
right
that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, so let's just say our team was very busy over the last 4 months. And really one of the first requests that we got in our clinical education team was to help with the creation of even the very basic training, because we knew that new providers were going to be ventilating patients and doing things that maybe they weren't comfortable doing, or hadn't done in a while. So we certainly put together a lot of very quickly modular training. And then we also have the ventilation app, I believe that you talked about it in a previous podcast. And that actually went beyond Medtronic products, but really one centralized place for providers to access user manuals and training information. So I think, we're really proud that we mobilized pretty quickly to provide that to folks.
As a clinician, we were much more accepting of remote support. Actually, I think we worked out that it was quicker and easier to accept that remote support. Can you turn your iPhone around and there are other phones available. Could you turn your camera on your phone around and let me talk you through that? It was, I think in many different aspects, we embraced that opportunity.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think the first thing that I wanted to make sure that we covered today, because, as clinicians, we don't always really understand product development and market selection. Like how are those decisions made? I'm sure it's very, very complex. So what does that process look like of product development?
So if you think about where medical affairs becomes really critical to a business like ours, it's when you're entering new markets. So what we'll look at is there's existing markets, which, you're basically competing for share with some features and benefits. And then there's new markets where you're assessing new vital signs or new metrics for a patient, all intended to drive value for the system, for the caregiver, and for the patient. Proving that becomes really critical up front. So just a great idea of I can add this to this thing doesn't really work. So the option for those types of devices is to do nothing. So I don't manage this and I'm quite fine. So Jen's team are masters at figuring out, well, where is the value? So before we even go into a new segment, her team will help the commercial group decide whether or not there's enough of the right type of patient, the right kind of care, and there's enough people that think that this is important, that if we go and develop the evidence for it, we could actually have a good opportunity of deploying it and getting adoption. Because again, there's no predicate device. You're really going after new markets. Without medical affairs and that competence, you frankly couldn't build new markets. So I think to me, that's the most critical part of how we, in terms of new markets anyways, how we leverage teams like Jen's.
I think I mentioned it, but the days of a cool new device that enters the market is gone if you don't have, if you can't prove the economic value, what's the clinical value. And sometimes those are tough discussions, at least for my team, to try internally and externally that, something might seem like a good idea, but if you can't get anyone to pay for it and you can't differentiate it from another product clinically, it's going to be a tough go. So that's the real challenge. And, I think even if you look back maybe 10 years, medical affairs was not really an established function on product development teams, and that's really changed over the last several years. So
the transition, it's been a long-standing debate. I was involved in some, European white paper discussions more than 20 years ago about where the burden of proof should lie with devices as opposed to drugs. And it does seem, as you've just referred to, Jennifer, as though the regulators have nudged device manufacturers towards the requirement to demonstrate something more akin to a phase 3 drug development. Now, it's very complicated because, the downside of that from the customer perspective is time and money when it comes to the acquisition cost. So where do you think we are on that journey at the moment? And who should bear the burden of proof is another one of the great debates. Should you make it and we work it out, or should you work it out for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, we see, increased certainly on the regulatory side with the medical device regulations in Europe, which we're all, still adjusting to. And, I think we're still figuring it out. I definitely think we are looking at new ways of generating evidence. We'll never, the phase, 3 or 4 phases of drug development don't really make a lot of sense for devices. But I do think things like registries, so that's one area that you'll probably see a lot more, popping up around the world, a lot in response to MDR requirements, but having registries where every time you launch new devices or new features, you can immediately start to collect data and large amounts of data, because big data is another big trend. It's not even a trend, it's a requirement, I think, to look at real world evidence. So I think we're still trying to figure out how to balance, that randomized controlled trial, which is still the gold standard and won't go away for certain situations, especially high risk devices, versus real world evidence. And I think we need both. Now, who bears the burden is another interesting question. I think as manufacturers, we want to be able to generate evidence, but we also can't do everything, so trying to figure out and actually my team's very involved in that, what's the minimum amount of evidence that we need to be able to really go to market? And then how do we continue to build on that? We have a really robust external research program, which is where we provide devices or funding, but the burden of the actual generation of the evidence is with our investigators. So still evolving, I think.
There's one other way to look at this one, Monty, is if you look at in terms of the burden, is you could launch a product intuitively, it makes sense. And we'll call that, a show me device. So show me that it works and I'll figure it out and I'll use it. And you'll get a certain percentage of population that'll adopt it. But if we look at it and say, we're missing indications or we're missing patient cohorts, and we're missing them because that group isn't quite convinced and they want you to prove it to me. And if that's the case, we'll often do a business analysis and say, should we do a study, and it'll be a cost or a clinical study, let's just say safety and efficacy are table stakes. So that always has to be done. But then the next phase when you're trying to gain adoption is really, it's our responsibility if we want to grow it, usually, to look at that market and say, this is the cohort that I want to go after, then I'll prove it. And then the goal will be to get adoption in that segment of clinicians that haven't quite made the leap over yet. So that's where we'll invest a lot of our money in terms of just moving it over, which is different than I think pharma in some cases.
If I may, there's one more thing on that, Vafa, in that becoming more complicated and the burden of proof and the value proposition, one of the things that we're starting to struggle with as clinicians is trying to understand the thing you referred to about the contribution of data to new and old monitors. In other words, to improve the utility of those by something that we can't see and hold. But so in other words, you've improved our understanding of how device A and device B are now better devices because you've managed the interface between them and you've repackaged the data and maybe added some machine learning. But we then get the kind of response as to how much you want, how and why does that cost more money? And we don't always think through the development costs of getting the data bit of it. So how's that going?
So we don't charge back. We as Medtronic don't price on our cost. What we do is we typically look at it and go, and this is a decision factor of whether or not you're going to do what you just suggested. If I can't drive disproportionate value, let's say the value is $1 or £1 for each one, I should be able to give you 2/3 back as the system and keep 1/3. So that's my internal barometer that says I need to drive disproportionate value for you. So I'm not arguing with you of why you need to have a red button on the end of this thing or why it's better because the casing is aluminum or those things are irrelevant because that's not how you're deciding on purchases. So if we do that up front, and if you do that up front, you need medical affairs to really be with you, and it's going to be a clinical and an economic argument. You do it up front, and you know that you can provide disproportionate value, and you can prove that. It's not just trust me, it's, you can prove that. Then you will have success. Otherwise, it's dead in the water. I won't even approve a project that doesn't prove that to us because we just know it's a waste of time for us.
That kind of leads us back to the medical affairs conversation that we were having. I know you touched a little bit on it throughout this, but tell me, Jennifer, a little bit more about what you guys are doing in the world of, professional education, what we can expect to see as clinicians, because obviously you make the business case for it, the economical case, but it's also getting it in the hands of the users and really figuring out what it is that we need to know about product and why that's important. It's more than just going to a dinner these days. Like, we really need to learn about what it is that we're utilizing in practice.
So as I mentioned, we do have our clinical education team. They're doing a lot of analysis always. And earlier in product development, it used to be that our medical education team was really engaged as we were ready to launch the product. But, again, moving that more upstream to say, what is it going to take to train clinicians on this? Is it driving awareness? Because some of the products really are awareness. This is the product, this is what it does, this is the evidence to support it. So tying that clinical evidence and economic value into the training. In some instances, it's really more hands-on training. And actually, in right now, a lot of our focus is how do we continue to train appropriately without being in person, because that's a real challenge for us, I'm sure, similar to conferences. Conferences are a big area for clinical education, and how do we transition to a more of a virtual approach. So we were already headed down the path of virtual training, just given a lot of new technology offering, and that's really been accelerated in the last couple of months. How do we use virtual reality is one area that we were already exploring, and we'll probably, double down on that. Preceptorship, so really that one-on-one, which we know is really the best way to drive adoption of a new product, versus through training. Obviously is not possible right now in person. So how do we do virtual preceptorship? But yeah, clinical education is, it's a requirement. It's actually a regulatory requirement for us, and it's critical, to open up markets, especially as we think around the world, being able to reach users where we don't actually have a footprint of trainers all over the place. This virtual offering, I think, will be really valuable.
Yeah. And then what about that you were saying peer-to-peer, you have key opinion leaders, those who have been in practice utilizing that stuff. How are you guys, still utilizing those people and really factor that into your whole picture of professional ed?
Yes, we have a team of, as I mentioned, physicians, nurses, RTs, which is very critical for our ventilation business.
Respiratory therapists is what RT stands.
Respiratory therapists. Sorry. Yes, apologize. And they really, so we have educators, so we have pure educators that may or may not be clinicians, but then we supplement and complement that with those with the subject matter expertise. Having peer-to-peer discussions, especially as we get feedback about new product development, new markets that we want to get into, having someone on our side that really understands our customers and has been there, to be honest, is critical. And yeah, they're really, involved in the whole wide array of education. I would say, again, that's relatively new in the last 10 years. I think that's another evolution in device companies versus pharma. We're having physicians on teams, clinicians, providing that subject matter expertise is required, and still relatively new.
Well, Vafa, I actually wanted to pivot and talk to you about the thoughts on ventilation and ventilators. And again, we know that there's a lot of work being done with Medtronic and helping to support those in practice utilizing ventilators that they may or may not be familiar with. So tell us about your thoughts on that and where you see the future of that.
Great, thank you, Desiree. So if you think about just the business aspect of it, ventilators have been a relatively flat market where innovation's rare, and we've had good brands out there, and we replace existing ventilators within healthcare systems. So when that typically happens in a business, you don't get disproportionate amount of R&D or research and development investment. So you don't get so much that you can really make huge swings. So what happened here is we took this opportunity of this heightened, situation where you had unlimited demand and you had very constrained supply. So we did some very unique things to be able to satisfy the early demand that was out there. So between, very non-traditional partnerships that we created to speed up, to make better factories, to make better components. Those are all initial work that we did. But we didn't forget about the future. And I think this was the difference, is that we said, let's use some of this excitement, and excitement will also turn into some revenue, and redeploy it over into research and development into the future. And what would the future look like? So when you look at our portfolio, what we've done is we've taken some of those funds in a very constrained year for healthcare. I mean, frankly, it hasn't been good for anybody really, with the exception of a few companies, or a few departments within companies. But if we took it and we reinvested it, we started to say, well, what is the issue here? So in this particular one, if you think about a contagious disease, you really don't want to put the only people that are going to get you through this, the respiratory therapists, the clinicians, you don't want to put them at danger. So we put all of our effort towards how could you move this remotely. So that was one of the most obvious ones that we looked at. And then that became a real focus for us. And we put those programs together in a matter of weeks. These are programs that typically in a company our size would take you forever, because you would have to have so many things going on to kind of get that going. And our CEO coined it vent speed, so ventilator speed. Could we make other products at vent speed? So you've all of a sudden totally raised the profile of ventilation and respiratory therapy within the biggest medical device company in the world. And you're investing disproportionate to what you were in the past and the future. So what are the other things that we could do? So these are other thoughts that we had is, which ventilators right now are working? Which ones are in a closet? Which ones are seeing an ARDS patient? Which ones have been on a patient for 14 days? Which ones have been on a patient for 2 days? This information will give us a ton of value when we're trying to manage resources, finite resources. So that's a couple of just quick glimpses into what we're doing in terms of the existing portfolio. And then the secondary part of it is, if you think about all these markets, we were looking at Africa, and we said, could we help that continent out? And there were countries in Africa where they had more vice presidents than ventilators. And that was a stat that we said, okay, we've got to focus on this, right? We've got to figure out how to do this. But you can't send a Puritan Bennett 980 to a place that doesn't have, experts to run it. So what are the models that we could actually create that would give you the right clinical outcome, but would be both most portable and easier to use? So this became another investment stream. So I'm really happy that we have not just sort of used this one moment in the sun in terms of the business, but we've actually taken it, redeployed it into the future. And I think we'll be able to have a refreshed, I'm confident that we're going to have a refreshed and innovative portfolio down the line that'll continue to pay back for clinicians and for patients.
You would have heard that at UCLH, we just to do a copycat of a previously used device that we were short of, Mercedes F1, stepped up to help us. They were quite quick.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I don't know what.
Yeah, you got to replace the tires though really regularly though. Be careful. Those tires burn out quick.
Too much time in the pit.
Uses a lot of gas too.
That's true.
It's true. Well, guys, thank you so much for chatting with us. I think this has been a very valuable conversation to have. Again, really focusing on the clinician aspect, like why are these things important to us? Because I think sometimes it's glossed over in the industry, and we've said a lot on TopMedTalk that we can't innovate as clinicians unless we have the equipment to do that, and that is developed by you guys. So I think, and we just can't take care of our patients without it, and we have to know how to use it. So I appreciate the work and the focus that you guys have on that. And, through all the COVID thing, maintaining patient and clinician safety through some of the remote monitoring and things that, you all were doing. So it's great work. And we do appreciate that.
Yeah, we're a team.
Yeah.
And, I think it's good for everyone to remember that. We're an interdependent team.
And we can't thank you enough, the respiratory therapists, the clinicians, everyone that took care of these patients, really going in front of a very dangerous situation. So we really can't thank you enough, and you've all been on our minds throughout.
And that goes out to all of our listeners for sure. That is a wrap for us today on TopMedTalk. Please be sure to check out TopMedTalk.com for our conversations. All of the conversations that we had during EBPOM, we recorded video this time. So we had some podcasts out there that you can find on our TopMedTalk YouTube channel. And of course, we're on social media, so you can look for us there, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all that good stuff. And be sure to check out EBPOM Chicago. Monty, it's coming up in 60 days, I think we decided.
Yeah, we've been working on it already. I can't believe we had 2 days off and we started on EBPOM Chicago. It's actually another virtual event. I think we've just heard that the International Society of Perioperative Medicine, because we already work with the perioperative exercise and training team, they're going to join in with it, which is going to be great.
Yeah.
So that's looking really exciting. I know thousands have signed up already. And after that, we've got Dingle, west coast of Ireland. We've just got a new program out for that today. And then we're into early next year into Las Vegas.
Yeah, Las Vegas, we're going to be with the ASA there.
Yep. Yep. It's not all about the money, but we will be talking about the money. the business side of the delivery of high value care.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, appreciate everything, the support for Medtronic. You know, TopMedTalk is a free global podcast, and we can't do it without the support of you guys and our other sponsors. So we do appreciate that. We want to maintain it free for, everyone around the world. So we thank you for that, and thank you for listening. Cheers.
TopMedTalk.
Nick Majerison here. Have you got yourself onto ebpom.org yet? If not, you might not be aware, EBPOM Chicago tickets are free for a limited period only. Go now to ebpom.org. Evidence-based perioperative medicine. ebpom.org.